Good morning. I'm Greg Myrie. I'm a national security correspondent with NPR, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this very special event at the Atlantic Council here in Washington. The Council's Eurasia Center is launching a new memo to the President with some very ambitious goals regarding Ukraine. The memo is signed by more than 40 national security figures and lays out two very specific points. One, how to help Ukraine win the war against Russia, and two, how to help bring Ukraine into NATO. The Atlantic Council has assembled an all-star panel here whose members need only the briefest introductions. Just to my left is Deborah Kagan, Senior Advisor to the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and to her left, Ambassador John Herbst, the former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. We have two other panelists who will be joining us virtually. One of them is Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, the former ambassador to Russia and former Deputy Secretary General to NATO. And I believe our fourth panelist has been delayed, but we hope that he will join us soon. He is retired Army General Wesley Clark, the former Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And now I will turn it over to these distinguished individuals to present the memo to the President. Ambassador Herbst.
Greg, thank you very much. This paper is a result of concerns that a group of 42 who've signed on to this paper have, that we face an existential challenge or a great security challenge from Putin's Russia. His war in Ukraine is part of a much broader effort to restore Moscow's control across the post-Soviet space. And if he is not defeated in Ukraine, we will face a major security challenge, a direct threat to our interests in Europe of possible provocations and war against our NATO allies, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania. And we assembled a group of people. We did 3 roundtables of 90 minutes each. We sent literally many hundreds of emails to come up with a paper which we think represents American interest and calls for strong policy by the administration. One, to supply all the weapons Ukraine needs, more advanced weapons in adequate numbers on time, so they can in fact defeat the Russians in Ukraine, so we don't have to worry about the Russians going beyond Ukraine, and to ensure security in Europe, stability in Europe for generations to come, to bring Ukraine into NATO. The Biden administration has done an admirable job in providing substantial assistance to Ukraine, military and economic, rallying our allies and partners to provide assistance to Ukraine, to isolate Putin, but they have not done enough to ensure a Ukrainian victory. This paper is a way to point out how we can get that victory and thereby secure American interest in the most economical way possible. Deborah, over to you.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the military state of play about the weapons themselves. So it has been sort of a torturous long road here since the beginning of this latest iteration of this war, of getting Ukraine the equipment it needs to actually win, as opposed to hold space that it already has and to take and hold new space. And a lot of this is fear of escalation that went on, and I think that's lessening over time because, as we've seen, every time the Russians threaten to do something, it really doesn't happen. And there's been a lot of damage done to the Russians, and those issues have not happened. But there still is this huge hesitation to give Ukraine weapons that have long-range ground-launched fires that could actually reach places in Crimea to suppress Russian air defense, Russian command and control, Russian fuel depots. And there is still this huge reluctance to do that, and a very slow, torturous move to give them heavy armor, which finally happened, and to give them what they really need in terms of controlling any airspace. As we know from many wars, that if you control the air and even have air parity and you control the sea lanes, you win. It's not a difficult equation. It's been this way throughout history. And so the problems that still exist here are this reluctance to give Ukraine ATACMS that go 300 kilometers. Now, this is not just about one weapon, it's the compendium of all the weapons working together because of fear that they'll use it to strike Russia. So I want to just point out two quick things here. One, there have been given rules of engagement to the Ukrainians by a number of countries who've supplied Ukraine with arms and equipment. Ukraine has never violated those rules of engagement. They've never violated those caveats on how to use those systems. And I want to correct a misnomer, too, because there's some people who think every country has those same rules of engagement on whether Ukraine can use those weapons against Russia proper. Not every country has those same caveats. Only a handful do. So that's an important point. And the second point of this is, and I have to give an Iraq analogy. We have given Iraq F-16s, we have given them all this stuff, and we gave them rules of engagement. My question is, do we trust Iraq to adhere to rules of engagement more than we do Ukraine? I think this is a really important point that we have to look at, and there's been no evidence that these have ever been violated. So I would just say, just at the top of this, that give them what they need to win, not just dally. Give them what they need to suppress the air defense. Give them what they need to fight back against 40% of territory that has been landmined. And the Russians have this nasty habit of when Ukraine does forward operations and gets rid of some of these landmines, Russia then comes and puts new mines behind them. And I think that's really important. This is not a humanitarian fought war in the least, and people ought to understand that. And one last word about cluster munitions. The screaming and yelling about cluster munitions has come from human rights organizations that have said absolutely nothing about the massive casualties among women, children, and civilians in Ukraine. But somehow they're worried about cluster munitions, which are mostly used to take out landmines in these fields and to go after Russian troops. And I would really like to have some understanding of that. And if and when the administration decides to give them the multiple rocket launch systems for the ATACMS, those will be only 150 kilometers. But it's the same thing. You're not talking about killing civilians with these. You're talking about taking out enemy combatants and taking out the massive amount of landmines that Russia has put in the way to kill as many people as possible.
Great. Go to Ambassador Vershbow.
Okay, thanks very much. Good to be with you this morning, even virtually. And I missed some of Deborah's presentation, but I think I already know what she said. So let me move on to the second recommendation in our memo to the President, which is to set Ukraine on a path to NATO membership. And we are, I think, united in the view that ultimately the most reliable and most effective deterrent against any future Russian aggression is to bring Ukraine into NATO. And that would complete the integration of Europe that was so rudely interrupted by Mr. Putin with his full-scale invasion. Now, the Vilnius summit this past summer set Ukraine on a path, but didn't go far enough. It said the right words, that Ukraine's future will be in NATO. It simplified the process for Ukrainian accession, for example, by dropping the requirement for a membership action plan. But it was a missed opportunity, in our view, to move decisively beyond the famous 2008 Bucharest summit decision, which declared, without explaining how, that Ukraine will become a member of NATO one day. So I think NATO's 75th anniversary is an appropriate occasion to take more historic and concrete steps that define Ukraine's path and start the NATO wheels turning, at least to begin a process that would ultimately lead to their accession. Now, we don't pretend that this is a simple decision for NATO. While NATO brought a divided Germany in 1955, while Soviet troops were still on German territory, this would be the first time the alliance would seek to bring in a country engaged in active combat with a hostile neighbor. So any movement toward Ukrainian membership would have to take that into account and also be compatible with current U.S. and allied policy not to become combatants in the current war. Now, if Ukraine were headed toward victory, with the fighting coming or nearing an end, we could follow the NATO enlargement script that was used most recently with Finland and Sweden, an invitation to NATO membership followed by accession talks, signature of an accession protocol, and ratification. But I don't think we're going to be there by the time of the Washington summit next July, and we need to be prepared for different, more ambiguous scenarios in which the conflict continues. Now, some of our allies have suggested that we simply state that Ukrainian accession will not be possible until the war is over. That would be a simple solution, but it would give Russia an incentive to drag out the war for years, and it would be tantamount to giving Moscow a permanent veto on Ukraine and NATO decision-making. Our approach, in a sense, flips the script that I just described for you. We would invite Ukraine to begin accession talks at the Washington summit, but leave an invitation to actual membership for a later separate decision. The United States and NATO would show that they were serious by starting or accelerating the concrete work to prepare Ukraine for membership, but taking account of changing conditions on the ground. So the timing for Ukraine's actual accession would be left open, giving allies in Ukraine time to work out solutions to problems related to bringing in a member still engaged in a war with Russia. For example, in a scenario in which Russia still occupied some parts of Ukrainian territory, we might proceed with accession, but apply Article 5 only to territory fully under Ukrainian control. Or we might agree to provide additional offensive and defensive capabilities so that we could prevent Russia from reattacking liberated Ukrainian territory. The aim would be to ensure the credibility of the Article 5 guarantee at the time of actual accession and over the longer term. So that means we would, of course, continue with the military assistance to Ukraine, which will provide the interim security guarantee until NATO membership becomes possible. So that's a short summary of where we come down. We think this approach could unite allies, more proactive and the more cautious allies, and provide a concrete signal to Ukraine if they've earned a place in NATO and that their ultimate destination is to be part of our transatlantic community.
Ambassador Vershbow, thank you very much for that presentation, as to all our panelists. So what we're going to do now is have a conversation for a little while, but we're going to leave some time for questions. So if you want to contribute questions, whether you're here in person in Washington, around the US, or in Europe, you can go to askac.org and submit your questions, and we'll get to that in the last 20 minutes or so of our presentations here. I will direct these questions to individuals, but everybody should feel free to jump in. I know we have a lot of strong opinions here. Now, this is a very ambitious memo with two very distinct parts: helping Ukraine win the war and then helping Ukraine find a path into NATO. Ambassador Herbst, I'd like to start with you. Ukraine defines victory as forcing all Russian troops off their soil. Is that your definition? Is there any other realistic definition?
That is how Ukraine currently defines victory. I'm not sure that that's how they will always define victory. I think there is a lesser possibility, which could also be considered a victory, but again, this will be for both Ukrainians to decide, and for that matter, for US officials to decide. A Ukraine that emerges within territorially secure borders, economically viable borders, that has full run of the Black Sea, that has substantial armed forces armed by the West, and that is a member of NATO, is a Ukraine that can be secure and prosper. And that would be a very clear defeat for Putin, whose aim, again, is to establish political control over the country. It's not for me to determine this outcome, but I could see that being a plausible one that Ukrainians can accept if that's in fact how things develop. That does not mean, however, that that has to be the outcome. And I would add that even in a lesser possibility, Ukraine must have certain control, and note that word certain, over Crimea, so that Crimea can never again be a space from which Moscow can launch military operations against Ukraine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, Deborah, I was in Ukraine last November when the city of Kherson was liberated by the Ukrainians. the front line hasn't really moved very much since then, and it doesn't seem like there's any one single weapon that's a magic bullet. You mentioned ATACMS, and there'd have to be a compendium of weapons. But it sounds like you're talking about dramatically expanded levels of support. Is that realistic? What countries are capable and willing to do that right now?
Well, first of all, I think this Putin's dream that the support for Ukraine will fall by the wayside is really Putin's fantasy. And it's just not accurate. And many of our allies, some of whom are here today, understand that this support ensures their own security, not just Ukraine's security. So that's not going away. The second thing I would say is a couple of things about that. We tend to look at, most people in the West, maybe in the East as well, tend to look at war the way they fought their very last war. This is not 22 years of counterinsurgency. This is more like Korea, which was the last time the U.S. actually went to war without air superiority, which they never did again after that. And it's not like the last war all the armchair generals are talking about. It's a different kind of war. The second thing is, and I briefly mentioned it before, is 40%, approximately 40% of the territory that Russia has occupied has been landmined. No other place on Earth has ever had these many landmines or these sophisticated landmines. It just hasn't happened. The third thing is, it's not just long-range fires from air-launched or ground-launched. It is when an army moves with its armor, because there's been a lot of, I'm sure you were leading to this question about the attacks on some of the tanks and the heavy armor. You need short-range air defense. We talk about air defense of cities and soft targets and the like, but there's also a necessity for that sweet spot between 4 or 6 kilometers and 16 kilometers, that you put on the back of a truck that moves with that armor so that the Russian attack helicopters that use missiles, aircraft, cannot effectively take out that armor. So that's another point of why. And then the demining equipment. I don't know that there's enough demining equipment on the face of the planet right now to make a dent in this, which is why the DPICMs, the cluster munitions, were so important, because they can take out a big chunk of those minefields. So those are things that sort of mitigate against the type of movement people expected to see. And then the last piece too, again, it's not one weapon, but if you have something other than the Sukhoi 27 and the MiG-29, if you start getting those Block 15 fourth generation aircraft, the F-16s in there, and we're not talking about dogfighting. We're talking about, the Russians use their Air Force as a support for their army. It's an army platform. They don't dogfight. So everyone talking about that is sort of a misnomer. So we're talking about being able to have the type of weapons where you can shoot from a distance and take these out, where you don't necessarily need over-the-horizon line of sight. So it's a compendium, as I said, of all of these things, but there's sound reasons why the regaining of territory has been slower.
Right, and so just very briefly, you've seen that, again, as Ukrainians try to advance on the ground, their forces have come under helicopter fire, for example, which, so to fight against those helicopters is very critical. But do you see any significant changes on the horizon beyond what has already been given in replacement ammunition? But as the war evolves and Ukraine needs different things, do you see that coming, or do you think we're hitting a wall in terms of the level of?
No, I don't think we're hitting a wall. And in fact, defense ministers are meeting this week, first the Ukrainian contact group, I believe tomorrow, and then defense ministers in Brussels. And I think what we're seeing in Europe is really remarkable. And I look to Ambassador Vershbow on this, but I would argue that there's more burden sharing now among allies than there's ever been in the past 40 years. And there is a recognition of beefing up their own defense industries. And not to be insulting to ours, but we have so many rules and regulations, and our hands are tied so much here, that there are defense industries in Germany and Sweden, in the UK and France and others, who are moving at light speed to produce new equipment, better equipment, and they're supplying it to Ukraine. So I would argue that they see this as critical to their own security as well, and they're not expending blood and treasure, and that is worthwhile investment for them to make.
Ambassador Vershbow, this is a radically different approach, trying to bring in a new NATO member that's at war, flies against the approach that's been taken ever since NATO's founding. So could you explain the difference between a membership action plan, which is the traditional way a country gets into NATO, versus what you're talking about is a membership accession talks? And then maybe walk us through a few of the steps where you think there could be genuine progress at this stage, even if the war continues.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, our proposal is ambitious and it's a little complicated as well. But first, in terms of the distinction you asked about regarding the membership action plan versus what we're calling membership accession talks, but it's just terminology could be changed as well. But the Membership Action Plan was a program launched more than 20 years ago to prepare any country interested in joining NATO for the kinds of reforms, both defense reforms, political and economic reforms, it would need to undertake to become a serious candidate that might ultimately receive an invitation. So it's a much more long-term process over many years. In one case, Northern Macedonia, it was in the Membership Action Plan for over 15 years. But it has worked very effectively to bring countries more in line with NATO standards, to commit to the kinds of reforms that they also need to do for the European Union in terms of rule of law, civil society, civilian control of the military, things like that. What we're proposing is a slight rearranging of the sequence of how pretty prepared candidates are brought into the alliance. And we saw this most recently with Finland and Sweden. They received an invitation to join the alliance, which then triggered several weeks of accession talks on these different dimensions of the responsibilities that they would need to uphold as members of the alliance. We would, as I said, we would flip the script slightly in order to deal with the greater challenge of bringing a country that's at war with Russia. We would only invite them to begin accession talks and start the practical work of readying themselves for membership, but make it a separate political decision as to when they would actually be brought in as members benefiting from the Article 5 decision. So that's in very simplified form what we have in mind. We know that some allies are a bit nervous, a bit cautious about going very far down the accession road when the war is still going on. We think we've struck a balance between showing the Russians that they can't exercise a de facto veto, but at the same time taking into account changing circumstances and risks on the ground as we go along.
Mm-hmm. Have you discussed this with other countries, even if just informally, either not at the government level, if that's the case, or even just with other figures like yourself, national security professionals or diplomatic professionals? And if so, what kind of response have you been getting?
We haven't shopped it around yet formally, but now that the report is published, we hope people will send us their comments and we can take criticism. But I think that we got a lot of insights from the process itself in drafting this memo with all the different signatories. We have a very lively debate on whether we should go farther than this, whether we should go less far than we had in mind. And that's why I think we found a kind of a balance that could make this a political winner in the process of building consensus within NATO.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Hurst, maybe let's pick up a little bit on that. The timing on this would seem tricky no matter what you choose. If you say, we'll discuss Ukrainian NATO membership after the war, well, you give Putin every incentive to drag the war out as long as possible, maybe even settle for a frozen conflict, because that would have that effect. But if you offer membership while the war is still ongoing, you raise this whole thorny questions that haven't really come up before. So talk about the thinking on trying to time this at the best moment.
I will answer your question, but I want to just make one point from what I said earlier. I described a less ambitious victory for Ukraine, but one of the reasons we wrote this paper is because we think that if we properly supply Ukraine, they there's a good chance they would make it untenable for Russia to retain control of Crimea without, in fact, Ukrainian forces having to enter the peninsula. I just wanted to offer that clarification because that should be what we're shooting for. As for your question, as Sandy mentioned, this is a really thorny question regarding how you bring Ukraine into NATO.
Getting ready to get called here.
And sounds like Wes Clark is
General
getting
Clark
ready.
is joining us, yeah.
Anyway, we had a substantial debate within our group trying to see if it was possible to offer Ukraine an invitation to membership right now, straight out. And we decided, precisely because there's an unwillingness within NATO to wind up in a possible shooting war with Russia, that was not possible. At the same time, we have to make it clear to Putin and to Ukrainians that, in fact, the only way there will be a stable Europe for the foreseeable future is if Ukraine, in fact, becomes a member of the alliance. So the way to thread this extremely thin needle is to say we're going to start this process now. For those who are skittish about possibly being in a war with Russia, we're saying, well, this does not commit us to formally bringing them into the alliance. At the other hand, we take steps in this direction. At the same time, if we boost our military support for Ukraine, we make it much harder for Putin to exact a cost for that. We make it much more painful for him to pursue this war, a war which, in fact, the Russian people are not fully behind. Because otherwise, when they have a mobilization, draft-age men don't head for the exits. So that's our strategy is 2 points. Strengthen Ukraine so it could actually win on the battlefield and set the stage for the eventual entry of Ukraine into NATO. It's worth noting that despite massive Kremlin propaganda, serious Russians, including the man who stood up to Putin, Prigozhin, have said this war is not about Ukraine and NATO. This war is something very different. We need to act on that understanding. And again, because we are not prepared to wind up in a shooting war with Moscow right now, we'll wait until they invade the Baltic states, which is sort of the possible real downside of current policy. We should set the stage so, again, Ukraine wins on the battlefield as we pull Ukraine closer to NATO without pulling the trigger on bringing them in.
Great. Deborah, to what extent is is Ukraine now a de facto NATO army? I mean, I've seen some of this myself in Ukraine, where they were using an air defense system, an old Soviet S-300 defense system at the beginning of the war, making it work extremely well, given its age and limitations. They've run low, who knows, maybe run out of ammunition for those systems and can't get it anywhere else. So it's been the Patriot system, the Stinger missiles. So to what extent just has this war made Ukraine a de facto NATO military?
So I think Ambassador Vershbow talked a little bit about the membership action plan and why that's not really essential for Ukraine. And I would argue that a lot of the membership action plan, a big chunk of it was like 300-something things, checklists that you had to go through to become a NATO military. And Ukraine has already exceeded that. And I think less people forget Ukraine deployed with NATO forces back in KFOR in the 90s. They were in Iraq, in Diwania province. They have done stints with NATO countries before, and they've integrated well in the command and control structures and the like. Now, their experience in fighting this war has given them a leg up on many NATO members. And they understand what it takes. And I'm going to go back to education for 1 second. In Ukraine, students get STEM education in the 8th grade. So they're not taking a bunch of 17-year-old recruits, some of whom have had a hard time with high school here. And that's why they've had such great efficiency in learning these weapon systems. You can give them a mechanical schematic and they understand it. You can do remote maintenance and the like for this equipment and fixes because they understand how to do this. And that goes back to the education. So they're not coming in there as if they have no background in this. So one could argue that if Ukraine were to join NATO tomorrow, it would already be superior to a number of other militaries inside the alliance.
Right, right. No, me too.
Wes Clark is with us, but without video.
Ah, okay. General Clark, can you hear us? Okay, we'll see if he can join in here momentarily. Ambassador Vershbow, you've been the ambassador to Russia, and this war has exposed many Russian weaknesses. Its military, its need for Western technology, its inability to just have an honest discussion about what's going on in the war in its own society. But it's also demonstrated that legendary Russian resilience. Russian troops are staying and fighting. They're not fleeing. The Russian economy is coping. Aren't we looking at a very, very long war with an outcome that's impossible to forecast at this point?
No, I think you're right. We've seen the Russians who performed abysmally in the first weeks of this war and suffered enormous losses. At least learning from some of their mistakes, not being quite as incompetent as they were at the start. But we shouldn't be complacent about that. But I think it still remains to be seen how much they've improved and whether, as the Ukrainian counteroffensive begins to get traction, later than we had hoped, but it's beginning to get more traction, whether the Russians are going to have as easy a time as they think they will have in rebuffing the Ukrainian forces. I'd be interested in General Clark's view if he can come in on this, but I think that there are reports of declining morale, of desertions from the front. Russians treat their troops in very inhumane ways. They're giving the people that are recruited or drafted very little training in many cases. To the point that the average soldier sent to the front only can expect to live for 4 more months. So it's still, I think, Ukraine's to win. And that's why it's important that we not waste any more time in terms of the equipment that we send. And I think our allies are with us. In regard to the question you posed earlier, they are providing roughly the same amount in dollar terms of military aid as the United States, which is quite extraordinary. It is indeed, I think, a breakthrough for burden sharing, although we'll continue to ask for even more. But I do think that it ain't over till it's over, and I think the Ukrainians still have the potential to tip the scales even more. What they've done in Crimea and basically neutralizing the Russian Navy is quite extraordinary, given that they have no Navy of their own.
Deborah, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add one point to that. I think it's important to understand that Russia's ability to continue to have the weapons it needs and a lot of the ammunition is highly dependent on Iran. I think people should not forget that. And there's some evidence that some systems have started to flow from North Korea.
So the drones, the Shahed drones, are coming from Iran. What else is coming from Iran?
We think, and I'm not privy to all the intelligence, that there are also components to missiles as well. And because Iran modeled a lot of their things like on the Russian Iskander and the like. So I think that we have forgotten, a lot of people have forgotten the key role Iran is playing in this war. And they have forgotten that Putin, who used to make fun of Kim Jong-un, is now his best friend, and that there is some journalistic evidence, at least, that things have started to flow from North Korea. So that is an indication that Russia is not doing this on its own. And it's also an indication that our sanctions and our policies of blocking these systems have not succeeded.
Journalistic evidence, I like that term. I wasn't sure if that was a pejorative or an endorsement.
It was a compliment this time.
Okay, thank you. And how significant do you think the North Korean contribution will be? It seems to be in artillery shells and that sort of thing. But do you have any sense of how significant that might be?
No, because it's unclear at this juncture what they can give, but the Iranian piece is hugely significant. We should not underestimate that. And it's not just the drones. It's spare parts and everything else. And frankly, if the U.S. cracked down more on companies going through third-party cutouts to give the computer chips and the like to the Russians, it would hamper them even more.
Ambassador Herbst and Ambassador Vershbow, I'd like you to weigh in as well. You're talking about making a big, you think that this memo, this proposal you have here would be ideal to introduce it at the NATO summit in Washington next July, which would also be the 75th anniversary of the founding of NATO. But you might not have a lot of unity here. I mean, we're seeing the friction over funding for Ukraine right now. Wouldn't this potentially just add another divisive element into the whole Ukraine debate, if in the middle of an election year, no less?
There will be a debate over this. That's to be expected, and in fact, that's to be welcomed. One of the reasons why we did not propose something more ambitious is that even, I would say, the strongest national security voices in this crisis, who've argued for more advanced weapons to Ukraine in face of the administration's timidity, are leery about bringing Ukraine into NATO while the war is being fought. So we took that into careful account. But the point we're making is we are arguing to protect American interest by ensuring stability in Europe. And without Ukraine in NATO, there's no stability in Europe as long as the Kremlin has revanchist aims, which they most definitely have. And again, revanchist aims that go beyond Ukraine. That's the purpose. So we welcome the debate. We think that any sensible analysis of the international scene, any analysis that recognizes that if you want strength, if you want peace, if you want security, you have to be strong. You can't cower before the aggressor, which, by the way, is why you want to stop China on Taiwan, make sure Putin loses in Ukraine. This is the self-evident policy choice. We just need to make it clear to those who'd rather keep their heads in the sand.
Ambassador Vershbow, could you weigh in on that as well and just sort of address the idea of wanting to be taking on a big, bold approach, but also doesn't that create the possibility of more division on a Ukraine policy?
There's always that danger, but I'm relatively optimistic that we can build a consensus within the alliance on a proposal along the lines that we've put into this memo. I mean, there was already a debate on this at the last NATO summit in Lithuania earlier this year, and there was surprisingly strong support, not unanimity, and NATO needs unanimity. It's a consensus-based organization. But there was a lot of support for taking a more decisive step forward, and a few countries weren't ready for that, including the United States of America. But I think that if we're going to take to heart what Ambassador Herbst just said, that there's more at stake in this conflict than just the fate of Ukraine itself, but the fate of the international order, then we can't suddenly reverse course and put this issue at a lower priority. We must defeat Putin in Ukraine, and that's why pulling out all the stops when it comes to the military support, looking for short-term security guarantees that can back up the Ukrainians until such time as they're ready for NATO. All that needs to happen, even though there will be political ramifications. And of course, we have to get our own house in order when it comes to the defense budget. I can't make any predictions on that. But assuming we could keep our support going, continue to draw on strong allied support, I think there's an opportunity at this big anniversary summit in July of next year to make a real decisive step forward. Maybe not what the most radical advocates would seek, but something that begins the process, shows the Russians that this aggression is not paying off. It's only going to make their situation worse.
Got it. Deborah.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. I just want to throw this out there, Black Sea security. So one of the things that Ambassador Herbst mentioned is that this is not just about Ukraine. Russia has recklessly used hundreds of untethered sea mines in the Black Sea. Our Romanian friends have already seen a number of accidents in the port of Constanța of these ships that have been hit by these sea mines. This is Turkey's neighborhood as well. and Bulgaria lives there as well. And the idea that Russia's doing this is not just to block Ukrainian grain. It is to control the lanes of transit in the Black Sea, which of course is extremely important for even energy coming from the East Med and going up the Danube. And it's to make a threat toward those NATO countries and those commercial vessels that would transit the Black Sea, that they're never going to be safe. And I think that's a really important point to put out here, that this is not just about Ukraine. This is Russia trying to control the transit of commercial vessels, to hamper independent energy going to other countries in Central Europe and the like. And so I think just tying it to that little neighborhood of a couple of Ukrainian points misses the broader strategic objectives of Russia.
I think Russia had the same idea back in the Crimean War, and that didn't work out so well for them. Anyway, we'll save that for another time. Ambassador Herbst, you served in Israel as a diplomat. Israel very much in the news right now. But there's been this talk I've been hearing about, the Israeli option, a sort of informal security guarantee without a formal alliance of sorts. Do you see an analogy, or would that analogy hold in Ukraine or not? How would you assess that?
There are a number of reasons why it doesn't hold. First, Israel is a technological and military power in the Middle East, unlike any of its adversaries, its enemies, even Iran. Whereas Ukraine does not stack up as a comparable force vis-a-vis Russia. And well, as we see with the Hamas assault, savage assault on Israel, Israel does have serious security concerns. I don't have any doubt that they will manage that, unless the international community forces a ceasefire. Ukraine's problem is, in fact, more dangerous because their foe is larger, more powerful, and has great advantages. So the analogy doesn't quite hold. But there's another problem with this. The administration's policy, which overall has been solid because they prevented, via a massive effort, a Kremlin victory, has been timid, whether looking at the weapons portion or the NATO portion of the policy, because they are, let's use a polite word, overly concerned about Russian nuclear escalation, which I think is a problem. So they talk about an Israeli option when it comes to possibly Ukraine joining NATO. But a key part of our policy towards Israel, and I served in our embassy in Tel Aviv, was maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge. Whereas our weapons policy towards Ukraine is to give them enough to prevent a Russian victory, but not to provoke Putin, a very serious strategic error. Right. So there's a certain amount of confusion in administration policy when it talks about the Israeli option, because it's driven by that timidity, which is a problem.
Got it. So at this point, I'd like to turn and open this up to questions. Again, remember, you can write to askac.org. Looks like we already have quite a number of questions here. For the first question, we'd like to go to Dr. Harlan Ullman of the Atlantic Council. Dr. Ullman. I believe so, yes.
Thank you, and thank the panel. My first of two questions is to John Herbst, who is ambassador in Ukraine. John, I'm not very clear on what the Biden administration's strategy is towards Ukraine. It's obviously we're going to stay the course and do what we can, and we're not going to provoke World War III. I wondered if you could, in a short sentence or two, explain what the strategy really is, and tell me how you plan to implement the current changes that you propose, given the fact that the administration has been very reluctant to make change. It's a good report, but how do you get that done, and can you get that done? And for Wes Clark, if he's listening, or somebody may want to take his place as a surrogate, the war in Ukraine is really quite interesting in the fact that there's a huge dichotomy. On the one hand, we've got iPad, drone, space, satellite warfare, which is almost like a video game. On the other hand, we have the most vicious war of attrition, in which Ukraine is expending more artillery shells than the West can produce in several months on a daily basis. You have trench warfare. You have a return to a situation where World War I is not a bad analogy. Now, right now at the Association of the U.S. Army, people are saying, well, we need long-range fires. And of course, the Air Force will say, well, air power will overcome. I don't believe any of those is correct, quite frankly. So my point is, if Wes is listening, what do we take away in terms of how we may want to think about our forces in the future based on what's happening in Ukraine? So, John, what's our policy?
Regarding administration policy, I think it is clear. They want to prevent a Russian victory, so they will stay as long as it takes. But they also want to avoid either American involvement in the war itself in terms of soldiers, which of course I agree with, and they also want to prevent nuclear escalation. I agree with that too. I just think they go about that the wrong way. The problem with the policy, and we're seeing this now because of the revolt of the quasi-isolationists on the in the Republican Party in Congress, is that the basis for their policy may be undermined. Undermined because the war is going longer than people expect, but also undermined because the administration has yet to explain in very clear language that vital American interests are at stake. If they did that, if they pointed out that Moscow is a nuclear power on the march, that it is pursuing aggressive designs against core American interests, designs that included 2 cyber attacks on the United States 2 years ago without any serious response, that what we have here is not so much supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia, but containing an aggressive Kremlin at the least possible cost to the United States, I suspect that there'd be much greater support for our policy, including, especially among independents, and among those Republicans who've been influenced by the tiny quasi-isolationists in their midst. The president's going to give a speech on the war soon. I hope he makes that point. If he does, I suspect support among the American people will rally, and the quasi-isolationists will have the rug pulled out from under them.
Have a question here, and we'll direct this to Ambassador Vershbow. What about EU membership? How does that fit into there? Should we be talking, there might be some that would argue we should talk about EU membership for Ukraine first and then get to NATO membership later. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think both processes are important, and the EU accession process is already underway. It doesn't move as fast as NATO accession has in previous cases, but the European Union took the very historic decision to make Ukraine an official candidate for EU membership, and the wheels are turning there, but it may be several years before they reach the finish line. But I think both are important, and I think a lot of the reforms that the European Union insists upon when it comes to rule of law, when it comes to civil society, all these things I think are equally important for Ukraine as it seeks to integrate in the democratic alliance that NATO represents. So I don't think it's a question of which one comes first. I think both need to be pursued within the logic of the process that's available. And I'm encouraged that the EU, I think, is much more serious about Ukraine than they have been in previous debates on this subject.
And would you favor an accelerated EU membership process as well for Ukraine?
Yeah, well, it's always easy for Americans to tell the Europeans that they need to move faster. But I think given the stakes, as Ambassador Herbst just described them, the faster the EU can move, the better. But a lot of the burden lies on the shoulders of Ukraine in terms of meeting the very complex and comprehensive EU standards. But I think the Ukrainians, they can do it. And the possibility of membership gives them strong motivation.
Deborah, two-part question for you. Vladimir Putin, is this war going to end as long as he's in power? Isn't he going to push it, and he's put all his chips on the table? There's no way out for him as long as he's in power. And second part, after Putin, whenever he leaves the scene, aren't the most likely prospects to be somebody else equally hardline, if not more so, and somebody else from the security with a security focus?
So I'm gonna deflect on this because I know what I don't know, and I am not an expert on domestic Russian issues. Over to you, John.
One, if you read history, you know that every time Russia has a splendid little war that goes badly, there's a change in power, loosening for at least a time of centralized control, and usually a period of liberalization. That happened after the Crimean War with the freeing of the serfs, happened after the Russo-Japanese War with the establishment of the Duma, happened obviously at the end of World War I. So those who talk about a Neanderthal beyond Putin taking power are talking about a possibility. They're not talking about a likelihood, especially because this war was clearly a Putin special. Even his closest pals, the Siloviki, in his inner circle, were appalled when he gave that speech that was publicized a few days before the big invasion. Putin could, in fact, if he wanted to, declare victory, that he punished those quote-unquote Nazis in Ukraine, and pull out. I don't think he is psychologically inclined in that direction. So chances are he'll need a big defeat on the battlefield, either to reconsider or to provoke others in Moscow to remove him from the scene. And I think that's the play we should be making to help Ukraine launch that decisive battle to cut off Russian supplies to the Crimean Peninsula, which they can do if we give them the advanced weapons and they advance another 30 miles south and east.
Mm-hmm. Deborah, here's something perhaps a little more in your wheelhouse. There's a lot of talk in Ukraine now about domestic munitions production or with Western companies coming into Ukraine. Is that something that could make a difference in the short term? And we've seen an absolute revolution in Ukraine drone production and drone use, but again, it's fairly small scale. So is this something that could help, at least in a limited way in the short term, or is this really a longer term idea?
I think it's medium and longer term. There was a very large conference in Ukraine last week where you had the Minister of Strategic Industry, you had the Minister of Defense, all participating, and a number of countries sent both national and private companies to this conference, including ones from the United States that went. I think this concept of joint ventures and doing things together is good. It's the wave of the future. I think a number of Czech companies, for example, have already stood up joint ventures in Czechia, designed to bring in Ukrainian workers so that they can then transfer the industry back to Ukraine after the war when it's safe to do this. You have other Ukrainian industry that moved 50,000 tons of equipment further west so they can continue to keep production going, out of the range of Russian systems. So I think, yes, I think that is a wave of the future. I think Ukraine has this huge technological base, as we talked about the educational system, and I think there is a wherewithal and a know-how, and Harlan asked part of this question, but the Ukrainians they've learned how to MacGyver almost everything.
Amazing.
And
really amazing.
and this is, and I'll just say one thing about this. We have not fought a war against a near-peer adversary. We haven't done it. So these things about munition burn rates and everything, no one actually understood what was going to happen because they've never done it before. But I give kudos to both U.S. defense industry and European defense industry who are taking the lessons learned at light speed of what they need to do on this. And I do think there's a future here for these joint ventures going forward. And I think some of the Europeans who have a more flexibility than U.S. companies do in terms of laws and regulations, are going to be on the ground floor of this. And I would hope that the United States government allows our industry to have that same access.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I see General Clark has joined us. Hello, General Clark.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you very much for letting me in. It's, this is the problem. We've got a major conflict in Israel, and the news is on Israel. And meanwhile, the North Koreans are shipping artillery and ammunition into Russia as a result of the last visit. So the military situation in Ukraine is urgent. It's a crisis. Solving that problem is essential. And for Ukraine to go forward, we just have to remember, for Ukraine, Crimea is the same as the Golan Heights is for Israel. There is no effective Ukraine without Crimea. Without Crimea, they lose the mineral resources, the export, the control of the seas, their coastline. So this is not going to end easily with a ceasefire freeze in place and permanent negotiations. The Ukrainians know they can't put up with that.
And General Clark, let's tie some of these things together. Obviously, we're focused on Ukraine here, but it does seem there's some links to what is going on in Israel. For starters, Iran. Iran is providing drones to Russia. Iran, whatever role they may have had in the latest events in Gaza, has been a longtime supporter of Hamas in terms of money, technical support, that sort of thing. Could you talk a little bit about tying these together? And then I'll add one other thing. I believe the Palestinian leader in the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas, is on his way or is already in Russia, where he plans to meet with Vladimir Putin. So some of this linkage and between Iran and Russia and Hamas, and the need to have that it's not just one isolated thing. How to approach think about the counteroffensive in Ukraine or the fighting in Gaza, but that there's some linkage here in terms of actors that are playing together and need to be dealt with or addressed in a comprehensive way.
That's exactly right. First of all, the Soviet meddling in the Middle East goes back a long, long way. And Yasser Arafat got his first ideas on terrorism from the Soviet Union. And they're the ones that encouraged him in 1964 to conduct the first terrorist acts against Israel. So Russia's been involved in this from the beginning. And what's happening now is clearly a benefit to Vladimir Putin. He's off the hook. Ukraine's off the news. North Korea is providing support. Iran's providing support. And look, we don't know what's going to happen in Israel right now. But what it has already done is it's drawn an American carrier battle group, focused all American attention there. And meanwhile, on the other side of the world, China's watching. And they're asking, how strong is this country, America? They're already pulled in two different directions. They're easily distracted. Their politics doesn't work. They can't get a Speaker of the House. They can't put money into Ukraine. Looks like a pretty good time. And so when you're looking at Israel, you have to look at this situation in Israel as the same, Iran looking the same way that Putin did 2 years ago. Iran's looking at Israel being enmeshed in Gaza, looking at the effectiveness of the United States, asking itself, must it wait until it gets a nuclear weapon to unleash Hezbollah to destroy Israel? Or is this going to be the opportunity? And we're sitting on the edge of that right now. So it's a very difficult time for the U.S. national security establishment.
And one more for you, General Clark, since you've joined us late. One of the things that was discussed earlier would be if Ukraine were to get membership or move toward membership in NATO, how would you deal with Article 5? And I believe Ambassador Herbst and others have sort of said, well, it would only apply to territory under Ukrainian control. So, for example, taking today's status, the Donbass and Crimea would not be covered under Article 5. Could you talk a little more about how you think about that, and perhaps also you could just imagine what if Ukraine were to retake Crimea? Would it suddenly become under Article 5, and then even if the Russians are still very active nearby in the Black Sea? So just your thoughts on how that might how that might be addressed.
I think the formulation that Ambassador Herbst gave you about the territory under Ukrainian controls is a good initial formulation. But the concern is this: if you believe in a rules-based international order, which we say we do, and we say that's what the fight in Ukraine is about, then there's no reason right now why U.S. Forces cannot assist Ukraine in its legitimate defense of its own territorial integrity, except that from the beginning, there's been a sort of agreement. Was it a tacit agreement, an implicit agreement, an explicit agreement? Who conducted it, and how did it happen? That somehow we know Putin's red lines, and we've said, no, we can't possibly bump up against a Russian force, rather than saying we're supporting Ukraine in its legitimate territory, It's on Russia if they confront us. You know, we have nuclear weapons, they have nuclear weapons. We're afraid of their nuclear weapons. Why aren't they afraid of our nuclear weapons? So I think we have to be very careful with our deterrent. If we don't believe in its credibility, no one else will. There's been a 60-year campaign by the Soviet Union and now Russia to say, oh, nuclear war would be impossible, impossible. Yes, that's their campaign. It's certainly affected opinion in the West, but it hasn't stopped Russia from modernizing its nuclear arsenal and threatening it during this conflict. So we're at a real pivot point in U.S. global stabilization. We have had extended deterrence for 70 years based on President Eisenhower and the Strategic Air Command. It saw us through the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was used in 1973 when the Soviets tried to intervene in support of Egypt in the war then. And it's kept us safe and generally extended protection to all of our friends and allies. But if we don't believe it in ourselves, no one else will. And one of the problems we're having right now with the global South is that we've been so cagey trying to play Putin off to help us get an Iran agreement. Maybe we can do this, but we don't want to do that to Putin. You know, how can it be that this is a man who's a murderer, who's unleashed aggressive war? We know where his money is, but we haven't taken his money. We know where his daughter is, but she's still treated well. Why is this? Because we think we can still work diplomacy through this conflict. But we should have learned by now that Putin's not a reliable partner in diplomacy. So we have to face a very difficult emerging situation. And we're going to come back once again to the fact that our strategic nuclear deterrent is the ultimate arbiter. We've got to face it, we've got to understand it, and we've got to act like we believe in it.
So we're running a little short on time here. I want to have one question that will go around the horn, and perhaps all of you could speak to if it's sort of a 60-second answer. The Biden administration policy is, you know, as long as it takes. But what would you do? What's the thing you would want to do right now if you could change or alter or shape that policy going ahead? Deborah, let's start with you.
I would, I think as long as it takes just assumes that this will go on beyond the next election and then some. I think it doesn't have to go on that long. If we make the decision that we should have made months ago, give Ukraine what it needs to win this war, understand that there's not going to be any peace treaty without U.S. boots on the ground, because the last 100 years have shown that no peace treaty lasts without U.S. boots on the ground. We even see this in Kosovo today. And understand that all those little articulations and games that people look at aren't going to work. And just understand, give them what they need to win and let them win. Give them the systems they need to take out the Russian land bridge, take out the Kerch Bridge, let them reassume control, and let the countries that live on the Black Sea have free transit. Give them the air so they at least have air parity. Then we're not going to be talking about as long as it takes anymore, because it will take a lot less long.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Herbst.
I hope Deborah's right, and I do think if we gave all the arms needed, there's a good chance Ukraine could deal a decisive blow. But the main thing is to understand the long-term threat, which again, Putin is coming for our breakfast, and we need to stop him in Ukraine. And if we understand that there's a policy of containment, the money we're sending to Ukraine is like 3.5% of our defense budget. We sustained a cost of well over $1 trillion containing the Soviet Union for 40 years. By that measure, the $37 billion a year for Ukraine is small, and the threat is long-term. While we might be able to win this quickly, we need to be in it for the long haul, recognizing the dangers to us of Putin's revisionist policy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ambassador Vershbow.
Yes, I agree that we need to do more and do everything we possibly can to enable a Ukrainian victory. We need to embrace victory as the goal. We've been dancing around it for a year and a half, and I think that's contributed to questions as to what is our policy. Just saying that we're going to stay as long as it takes doesn't define the end state that we're trying to achieve. At the same time, I agree with General Clark that we need to do everything we can to ensure the credibility of our strategic nuclear deterrent and not be spooked by some of the rhetoric coming out of Russia. It's interesting that even Putin himself seems to gotten a little concerned about the excessive warmongering among some of his erstwhile liberal advisors about first use of nuclear weapons. We just have to continue to reinforce the message that the Russians will suffer catastrophic consequences if they actually use nuclear weapons, and but not allow our policy to be hamstrung by exaggerated fears of Russian red lines.
General Clark, you get the last word.
The administration needs to commit itself to a policy that Ukraine will win. This win includes regaining its territory, including Crimea and Donbass. Needs to provide the weapons as soon as possible to do that. Time is not on our side. This needs to be done immediately. And that's whatever the red lines were that were agreed with Putin, that was an entirely different situation. And we need to put him on notice. He's going to lose. We need to say it publicly and put the force behind it with Ukrainian our weapons and Ukrainian forces to accomplish that goal.
Thank you, General Clark, and thank you to all our panelists here today, and to our audience here in person in Washington, around the U.S. and in Europe, and perhaps even points beyond. So thank you all very much. A round of applause for our panel, please.